Don't bother coming to the wedding. You'll only embarrass us. That's what my own daughter typed to me at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, the cursor blinking under those words like it was waiting for me to argue. I didn't argue. I wrote back one word. Understood. Set the phone face down on the kitchen table and poured the rest of my tea down the sink because my hands had started to shake. 3 days later, that same girl left me 41 voicemails in a single afternoon, and her future in-laws left me 30 more, all of them begging, and not one of them got an answer. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and this story deserves to be told the slow way, the honest way, the way my late wife would have told it if she were still here to roll her eyes at the parts where I come off looking foolish. My name doesn't matter much, but you can call me what everyone at the credit union called me for 34 years before I retired. They called me the man who reads the fine print. I spent my whole working life in Thunder Bay, first as a teller, then a loans officer, then a fraud analyst for the regional branch. I was the fellow they'd bring a file to when the numbers smelled wrong. I could look at a loan application, a set of statements, a string of deposits that didn't add up, and I'd feel it in my gut before I could prove it on paper. My wife used to say I had a nose for lies. She meant it as a compliment mostly. She passed 4 winters ago, pancreatic, fast, the kind that doesn't give you time to get used to the idea. We had 1 child, a daughter, and after the funeral it was just the 2 of us against the quiet. Or so I thought. The daughter. I'll call her my girl, because even now, after everything, I can't quite bring myself to spit her name out like it's a swear word. My girl was 29 when this happened. Sharp, pretty, always wanted more than the modest life we could give her. That wasn't a flaw, not on its own. I wanted more for her, too. I paid for her degree at Lakehead, co-signed her first car, helped with first and last on an apartment downtown when she landed a job at a marketing firm. Her mother and I never had much, but what we had, we spent on that girl gladly. Then she met him, the fiancé, and more importantly, she met his parents. His family ran a string of long-term care residences across northwestern Ontario, private retirement homes, the upscale kind with chandeliers in the lobby and brochures printed on paper, thick as cardstock. They had money, real money, the kind that buys a cottage on Lake Superior and a second one in Florida for the cold months. The father drove a Range Rover the color of a wet seal. The mother wore a different coat every time I saw her. They were warm to my face in that practiced way. Wealthy people are warm, like they'd taken a course in it. The first crack came at Thanksgiving, the one we spent at their place because my girl insisted. Big house out past the marina. The dining table longer than my whole kitchen. Halfway through the meal, the father leaned back, swirled his wine, and asked me what a man does with himself after a career counting other people's money. He smiled when he said it. Everyone laughed, including my girl. I laughed too, because that's what you do, but I felt the temperature of the room and I filed it away. A fraud analyst never stops analyzing. It's a curse. After that, it got steady. My girl started talking different, using words like elevated and our circle, and the standard we're holding ourselves to. She started apologizing for me before I'd even done anything. At a dinner, she introduced me as, my dad, he's retired now, in a tone you'd use for something you'd rather have left at home. I told myself she was just dazzled. Young woman in love, swept up in a world that smelled like leather and money. I told myself it would pass. Did not pass. The wedding planning started in the new year, and it was, from the first day, an event designed to belong to them and not to me. They picked a vineyard estate near Niagara, a 12-hour drive from Thunder Bay, naturally, because heaven forbid we do it somewhere a working person could afford to attend. 180 guests. A live band flown in from Toronto. The mother took over every decision, and my girl led her, and somewhere in there the question of who would walk her down the aisle stopped being a question at all. I've found out the way you find out everything now, online. My girl posted a photo of herself with the fiancé's father, the 2 of them at a tasting, glasses raised, and the caption underneath read, "So grateful for the family that actually shows up for me. You'll never know what you mean to me." 60-some comments, strangers calling them the perfect family. Her future mother-in-law replied with a row of hearts and the words, "Our girl deserves the world." Our girl. I sat at my kitchen table in Thunder Bay reading that, and I want to tell you it didn't land. That a man my age has thicker skin, but the truth is I had to put the phone down and walk out into the backyard in my socks and stand there in the cold until I could breathe right. I'd taught that girl to ride a bike on this street. I'd sat up with her the whole night she had the croup when she was 4, both of us in the bathroom with the shower running hot so she could breathe. I'd held her mother's hand in the hospital while that same girl was in school writing exams because we'd decided not to tell her how bad it had gotten until it was nearly over. 30 years. And now she had real family, and I was the embarrassment they hoped wouldn't show up. I went back inside, and I didn't post anything, didn't text anything. I just opened a fresh folder on my laptop the way I'd done 1,000 times at the credit union, and I named it. And then I made myself a fresh pot of tea, the good loose leaf, and I sat down to think. Because here's the thing nobody in that vineyard photo understood about the quiet man they'd written off. When a fraud analyst gets quiet, that's not surrender. That's the sound of him going to work. I'd met the fiancé's family enough times to have collected things. That's a habit you never lose, collecting. Little things. The father had mentioned, more than once, expansions to the care home business, new properties, a big push into memory care because, as he put it with a chuckle, that's where the margins are, friend. The mother had complained at that same Thanksgiving about an audit that had come to nothing, thank God, and how their accountant was worth every penny. My girl, dazzled, had repeated to me how the family was basically printing money off the government's subsidies for senior care. Now, I'm a Canadian who spent his whole life in this system. I know how publicly funded long-term care works in this province. I know the per-resident subsidies, the staffing ratios the funding is tied to, the inspection regime, the reports that are supposed to be public. And I know that when a man brags that the margins in memory care are where the money is, and his accountant is worth every penny, and an audit came to nothing, a man like me starts to wonder exactly how those margins got so fat. So I made one phone call. Not to my girl, not to beg. I called an old colleague, a woman who'd left the credit union years back to work investigations for the province, the kind of work that looks at where public health care dollars actually go. I'll call her my friend because she was, and still is, and because what she did for me was a friend's favor and a citizen's duty rolled into one. I told her what I'd heard. I told her the names, the company, the properties. I didn't make any accusations. I just laid out what a man with my background would find curious. And I asked her where a private citizen with concerns could send those concerns so they'd actually be read. She was quiet for a moment on the line. Then she said, "You didn't hear this from me, but that name has already come up. More than once. Send me what you've got." What I had, it turned out, was more than I'd realized. Over the next 2 weeks, I did what I'd done for a living. I pulled the public corporate records, and corporations, directorships, the shell companies one layer down. I cross-referenced the care residences against the public inspection reports, and I found a pattern. Facilities reporting full staffing on paper, while inspection notes flagged residents left unattended, soiled, malnourished. I found one home where the reported nursing hours didn't match a single thing in the complaint record. I found numbered companies billing the family's main corporation for consulting and dietary services at amounts that made no sense unless the point was to move money sideways and shrink the taxable picture. I found donations to the right people, the kind that buy a quiet audit. None of it was proof on its own. But I'd spent 34 years learning that fraud isn't one big lie. It's 1,000 small ones stacked into a shape, and once you see the shape, you can't unsee it. I built the file the way I used to build them for the RCMP commercial crime referrals. Clean-sourced, every claim tied to a public document, no speculation, just the shape laid bare so anyone could see it. And while I built it, the wedding marched on without me. The invitation, when it finally came, was addressed to Mr., and my last name, like I was a colleague of the bride's, no father of the bride. A seat assignment in row 5. The fiancé's father would be doing the honor of walking my girl down the aisle. I learned this from a group email I'd been added to by mistake, then quietly removed from. My girl never told me herself. She just stopped answering my calls altogether, and when I texted to ask if we could talk, person to person, before her big day, she sent back the message I started this story with. Don't bother coming to the wedding. You'll only embarrass us." "Understood," I wrote. And I meant it. I understood completely. I understood that the people who taught my daughter to be ashamed of an honest man were the same people who doted their fortune on the backs of the most vulnerable folks in this province. The seniors in their beds, the families trusting them with a mother, a father. I understood that I had spent my career catching exactly this kind of person, and that for once the case had walked right up my own front steps and called me an embarrassment. I understood that I was going to finish my file, and then I was going to do the one thing those people had never once seen me do, which was nothing. Say nothing. Let it land in its own time. I finished it on a Thursday. My friend confirmed receipt and told me the file had gone where files go when they're good enough to act on. She told me to be patient. I'd been a fraud analyst for 34 years. Patience is the only thing I have more of than regret. The wedding was the second Saturday in June. I did not get in my car. I stayed home in Thunder Bay, and I'll be honest with you, it was the worst day of my life since the funeral. I sat in my late wife's reading chair by the window, and I let myself imagine it. The vineyard, the band, my girl in a dress I'd never see, walking on the arm of a man who'd called the abuse of the elderly a good margin. I imagined the toasts. I imagined no one mentioning her mother. I let it hurt all the way down, because a man who won't feel things is just another kind of liar, and I'd had enough of those for one lifetime. The phone started up that following Tuesday afternoon. The first call I let ring, then another, and then another. My girl's number. Then a number I didn't know. Then her future mother-in-law, whose number I did know. Voicemails stacking up. I sat there with my tea going cold, and I watched the screen light up over and over, and I did not pick up, because I already knew what had happened, and I wanted to hear it from the official channels before I heard the version they'd spin for me. The news broke that evening. Investigators from the province, alongside the RCMP, had executed search warrants at 4 long-term care residences owned by the fiancé's family. Allegations of fraud, falsified staffing records, misappropriation of public funds, and this was the part that stopped my breath even though I'd seen it coming. Neglect serious enough that 2 facilities were placed under emergency management to protect the residents. The father was named, the number companies were named, the worth every penny accountant was named. The wedding photos that had been all over my girls' profiles came down within the hour. The vineyard, the band, the row of hearts, gone. In their place, nothing. And in my voicemail, 41 messages from my girl that went from confused to frightened to weeping to a kind of small, broken sound I hadn't heard from her since she was a child and woke from a nightmare needing her dad. I listened to every one of them. That's the part people don't understand about me. I didn't take any pleasure in it. I sat in my wife's chair and I listened to my only child come apart. And I felt no triumph, only a deep and tired sorrow. Because there is no version of this where I win. Justice isn't the same thing as winning. I'd learned that at the credit union too. She came to Thunder Bay 11 days later, drove the whole way herself, 12 hours, showed up on my porch at dusk with no makeup, in a duffel bag and eyes swollen half shut. The fiancé, I'd later learn, had quietly stepped back the moment his family's name hit the papers. Not from her exactly, but from the wedding, the future, all of it. The whole gleaming world she'd been promised had evaporated, and she'd driven home to the only fixed point she had left. The one she'd spent a year being ashamed of. She stood on my porch, and she couldn't get a word out. So I did what her mother would have done. I opened the door wider, and I said, "There's tea on. Come in, out of the cold." We sat at the kitchen table where she'd done her homework as a kid. She told me everything between long silences. How they'd made her feel chosen, elevated, finally part of something that mattered. How the shame they taught her about me had felt at the time like growing up. How she'd known, somewhere underneath, that the way they talked about their residents wasn't right, but she'd told herself it wasn't her business. She asked me in a whisper if I'd known. If I was the one who turned them in. I'm an honest man. I won't tell you I didn't think hard about how to answer that. But in the end, I told her the truth. I told her I'd built a file the way I'd built 1,000 files, and I'd sent it where it needed to go. And I'd done it not for revenge, but because there were old folks in those homes lying in their own filth, while that family flew abandoned from Toronto. I told her I'd have done it whether she married into that family or not, because that's the man her mother married. And I wasn't about to become someone else just because being someone else would have kept me at the wedding. She cried then, the real kind, the kind that comes from somewhere true. And she said the thing I'll carry to my own grave. She said, "You could have just told me they were criminals." And I said, "Would you have believed me, or would you have called your father a bitter old man trying to ruin your happiness?" And she was quiet for a long, long time. And then she said, very small, "I'd have chosen them." That's the honesty that let me forgive her, not the apology. Anyone can apologize when the money's gone. It was that she didn't pretend. She knew exactly who she'd have been if the truth had stayed buried, and it frightened her. And she didn't look away from it. Her mother had that same hard courage right at the end. She stayed 3 weeks. We didn't fix everything. You don't fix a year of contempt with a pot of tea, no matter how good the leaf. But we started. She got a counselor back in the city. She wrote a statement for the investigators on her own without me asking, because some of what she'd overheard at that long dinner table turned out to matter. The father is still before the courts as I write this. These things move slow. Slower than anyone wants. 2 of the residences have new operators now, and from what my friend tells me, the residents are being properly fed and turned and cared for, which is the only part of this whole business that ever truly mattered. My girl asks me sometimes why I'm not angrier. Why I didn't let her drown in those voicemails a while longer, teach her a harder lesson. And I tell her the same thing every time. Anger is easy. Any fool can be angry. It doesn't cost a thing. The hard part, the part that actually makes you a father, is staying decent when being decent earns you a row 5 seat and a 1-word goodbye. I didn't expose that family to get even. I exposed them because I read the fine print, and the fine print said people were being hurt, and I've never in my life been able to put a file like that back in the drawer. She set her phone on my kitchen table the other night while we did the dishes, and it buzzed, and out of an old habit I glanced at it. A reminder she'd set for herself. It just said, "Call Dad, just to talk." Set to repeat. Every Sunday. I dried the last cup, and I set it in the rack, and I didn't say anything at all. Some things you don't need to read out loud. The voicemails stopped after a few weeks, and the house went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one I'd lived in since my wife passed. I sat in her reading chair one Sunday evening and let myself work backward through the whole thing, the way I used to walk a fraud file back to the first crooked entry. And what I found at the root wasn't my daughter's cruelty, and it wasn't that family's money. It was a choice, a long string of small choices, mine and hers and theirs, each one leading to the next as surely as one number follows another in a ledger. That family chose to treat the people in their care like line items, and that choice fed a fortune, and the fortune is what made them magnetic to a young woman who wanted to feel chosen. My daughter chose again and again to be dazzled instead of honest, until being ashamed of me started to feel like growing up. And me. I had a choice too the night that message came in. I could have begged. I could have raged. I could have driven down to that vineyard and made a scene a man my age has no business making. Instead, I sat down with a pot of tea, and I did the one thing that was actually mine to do, which was to look hard at what was true and refuse to look away. I won't pretend the file was the hard part. Building the file was the easy part, because I'd done it 1,000 times and my hands knew the work. The hard part was staying decent while I did it. It would have been so simple to let that anger curdle into something I could aim at, my own girl, to make it about getting even with her instead of about the old folks lying neglected in those beds. The thing I'm proudest of in this whole sorry business isn't that I was clever enough to see the shape of the fraud. Plenty of clever people are crooks. It's that I stayed steady long enough to do it right, and then I had the patience to wait, and then I opened the door when she finally came home, cold and ashamed and needing her father. If there's anything in this worth passing on, it's that those three things have to travel together, or they're worth nothing. Being good without the wits to act on it just makes you a soft target. Being clever without a conscience is exactly what that family had. And look where it took them. And both of those are useless if you fold the moment standing your ground costs you something. My daughter is sitting at my kitchen table again these days because all three held at once on the worst night of my life, when it would have been so much easier to let even one of them slip. She set a reminder in her phone to call me every Sunday just to talk, and she never has to be reminded. I think that's the only ledger that ever truly balanced for me.